housekeeping items to get through before we begin. Our outstanding IT department recommends that you use computer audio. There is a phone conference for audio only. If you have any issues connecting, we recommend using a headset, earbuds for a better audio experience, which, if you're lucky, may turn my monotone voice into more of a stereo voice. Thank you for muting other devices and apps to avoid distractions. We have muted your microphone and cameras will be off throughout this presentation. If you have any questions, we ask that you use the chat. You'll see that button at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter questions on the right-hand side. We will monitor and answer your questions at the end of the session. We may or may not get to all of your questions, but if we don't, we will respond via email and send that out to participants. You can certainly use some reactions that some people did to my lame joke. And also we will have some polls throughout this presentation to ask you a few questions. Just a quick note about those questions. Lisa, our guest of honor, will not answer any questions related to any ongoing investigation, specific orders you may have received, or any ongoing ministry visit. If you have any specific questions, contact your inspector or the MLITSD Health and Safety Contact Center. I'll put the number in the chat, but however it is 1-877-202-0008 or via teletypewriter 1-855-653-9260. Just for a better viewing experience, please do me a favor and hit the 3 buttons at the bottom of your screen. Therefore, you can view this presentation in full screen mode if you wish. Just a couple of goals for our Safety Connection. Of course, this is a forum to learn, share, and discover what you value. That's why we have polls and ask questions. We want to make sure we're able to answer those questions and provide some resources that will help you. We certainly want to virtually connect with everyone, facilitate any best practice exchange. So in the chat, if somebody asks a question that you might want to answer or provide some information or insight on what you did, then feel free to do so. Just the goals of today's webinar. We certainly want to raise awareness of the MLITSD's ergonomics campaign in the retail sector for this coming year. Part of that is understanding the requirements under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations as they relate to musculoskeletal disorders or MSD hazards in the workplace. Our goals are to increase your knowledge of MSD hazards and any contributing factors that impact manual materials handling demands for workers. We want to raise awareness of the risks related to manual materials handling from a ladder, for example. Understand any potential risks for struck by hazards that exist in retail workspaces, and learn what resources and assistance is available to workplaces as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Lisa Hooper. Lisa is a provincial ergonomist in the Occupational Health and Safety Branch, Fair, Safe, and Healthy Workplaces Division. So welcome, Lisa, and take it away.
There we go, off mute. Thank you very much, Don. And just to give a little bit more about myself, I've been with the ministry for about 18 years, and 15 of those years I was a field ergonomist doing inspections in many different sectors, including retail. So really happy that you could take some time out of your busy day to attend this webinar, and really hope that you find today's webinar helpful and have some takeaways that you can apply in your own workplace. So there's a poll happening on your screen there. If you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit of background in terms of the size of the business that you are, just to help us sort of gauge sort of who we're speaking with today. So of the responses coming in, number of our participants are in the medium to large employer size, a few in that small category, which for this poll is that 20 to 90 range. Oh, a few in the small, in the micro size as well. Great. It's nice to see the cross section there. I think that we got all. Oh, here's our second poll here. Again, just to kind of get a sense of what type of retail you're in. The retail class has a lot of different NAICS codes within it. So again, just to give us a bit of a sense of who we have today at the webinar. And there's a scroll down button along the side of the poll. So if you don't see something that's applicable, use the scroll to see if that can help you out there. So the things are coming in. So a few convenience, department stores, some warehouse clubs, building materials. So a good sort of cross section there. Some folks from the used merchandise area, clothing stores. Terrific. So again, it's great to see sort of a good cross section from the retail sector joining us today. Perfect. Well, welcome everybody. So thank you for the poll, providing us your feedback there. It does help Dawn and I to sort of help in terms of gauging some of our examples and that sort of thing as well. So we will get rolling here. I'm just going to take control. Just as sort of a background note, we do, like to ensure that everyone's aware that the presentation today has been prepared to assist yourselves in understanding your rights and duties under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. However, the presentation does not constitute legal advice. To determine your rights and obligations under the Act, please contact legal counsel or refer to the legislation. So I'll move forward. We have another poll question for you here, just to sort of gauge sort of where you're coming to the presentation today in terms of your level of understanding and knowledge on the topics. There's three separate questions here, and you'll see in the poll there's a 1/3 in the bottom right hand corner. So if you could please make sure that you cycle through and answer all three questions for us, that would be very much appreciated. So just take a moment to sort of give us an idea of sort of where you're coming from today. The responses are coming in. Oh, thank you, Trina. So I'm not sure, Dawn, are you able to see the poll results there? They're not coming up on my end.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, we just had to close it, so you should be able to see it now. If you can, I can. Yeah, it's so right now most everybody is for the first question. How would you rate your current knowledge on material handling and storage? Right now we're at about good, and then great is next with advanced at about 4%. The second question, how would you rate your current knowledge on ladder use and storage? Majority in the good to great area. And then the third question, how would you rate your current knowledge on pedestrian safety and struck-bys? The majority of individuals are around good, and great somewhere in that range. So mid-range for most of the answers.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. Okay. Well, we'll get rolling here. I'm going to start by just sort of giving a bit of an overview of the campaign. So the Ergonomics Retail Campaign is a year-long initiative that involves the ministry's field-based ergonomists. They will be conducting ergonomic-focused inspections to support three key areas, and it may have kind of been highlighted earlier in terms of the goals of our webinar today. So the first is to support MSD prevention in the retail sector. For those who may be new to this term, there's probably most everybody from the poll questions are familiar with MSDs or musculoskeletal disorders. It's an umbrella term for a number of injuries and disorders of the musculoskeletal system. So these could be muscles, tendons, nerves, bursas, blood vessels, joints, ligaments. Many things sort of make up that musculoskeletal system. And some may have heard terms like repetitive strain injury, overexertion injury, cumulative trauma disorders. These are all describing MSDs. And this campaign is looking and addressing hazards that contribute to these injuries. So real focus on what are the hazards, and we're going to go through those today, but also those contributing factors that are sort of intensifying the impact and risk for workers. The second focus relates to manual material handling and ladder use, as well as storage practices that can lead to increased risks, not only for musculoskeletal disorders, but also falls. And lastly, the campaign is also aiming to elevate awareness of the struck by risks to retail workers associated with working around whether it's delivery vehicles or material handling equipment within the workplace, perhaps in parking lots where there's customer vehicular traffic. So these are our sort of focuses or foci for the campaign. And in terms of a timeline, I did note it was a year-long campaign, very similar to many other of our other ministry campaigns. They do start with an education and awareness phase. So we're in that phase right now, and this webinar is part of that phase to let the sector know about the campaign and what it will entail. We're very happy to be partnering with WSPS. I am sure Dawn later in the presentation is going to be sharing with you like supports and services available to increase your knowledge and capacity to address the hazards related to the sort of focus areas for the campaign. Secondly, there's a second phase, which is the enforcement phase, and that starts in June and will involve our regional based ergonomists will be conducting workplace inspections. So we do have ergonomists who are inspectors go out and conduct visits to workplaces. And I will go into that a little bit further in terms of sort of what a visit from an ergonomist might look like. So you might be wondering, so why is there an ergonomic focus in the retail sector? Well, when we look across the four sort of retail classes that make up the retail sector, each year, roughly about 30% of the WSIB injury claims are musculoskeletal disorders. So they do represent a fairly large portion of the injuries that are occurring in this sector. And by the very nature of the product flow through a retail workplace, there are many manual handling steps that take the product from receiving to storage to display. The product is handled again at the point of sale and perhaps during customer support or delivery. So there's these material handling demands can expose workers to repetitive or cumulative loads and overexertion demands that can lead to musculoskeletal disorders. So that was one of the reasons for that, the focus on the manual handling aspects associated with the movement of your loads through your workplaces. Secondly, ladders are also a commonly used piece of equipment in retail. looking at historical injury data, the retail sector, this was very surprising, had the second highest injury count, second to construction, for lost time ladder related injuries. And interestingly enough, when these ladder related injuries were broken out a little bit further in terms of the type of injury that was occurring, the most prevalent ladder related injury was a strain or sprain. So again, I think there's definitely some, you know, a visit from an ergonomist can help you sort of look at those aspects around the manual aspect of the ladder use and the material handling access of loads. So we'll touch on that today. As part of our campaign, we also wanted to incorporate struck by awareness into this campaign. It has been an element of previous campaigns with the ministry and our material handling campaigns in the past. And there can be ergonomic related factors that contribute to struck by occurrences. For example, workspace design, operator line of sight, cognitive loads. So it is something that, from an ergonomics perspective, by taking sort of an ergonomic lens, there may be some avenues that you can look at in terms of reducing your risks to your workers related to struck bys. And these occurrences accounted for 18% of the WSIB claims in retail between 2020 and 2024. And again, that could be, work tasks, including receiving, distribution, customer support, and delivery. So again, there are excellent opportunities to sort of make some inroads into these areas. So I'm sure some of you have, on the webinar today, have had an inspector visit your workplace to conduct an occupational health and safety inspection. If you want to use your reaction button and just kind of give me a thumbs up, I'm sure there are many out there that have had that occur for them. Yeah, I see quite a few. So these campaign visits or campaign inspections are proactive visits to our retail workplaces, with the focus on the key areas I mentioned earlier. So the focus is going to be on the MSDs, ladders, and man material handling, as well as struck by hazard awareness. The inspections by the field ergonomists are the same in terms of inspections that you would have maybe had in the past by ministry inspectors, in that they are unannounced. They typically unannounced. And when the ergonomist arrives at the workplace, they may ask to speak to a member of management if available, or the workplace health and safety contact. Sometimes that's the management rep on the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Depending on the size of the workplace, the ergonomist may also ask for a worker health and safety representative or a worker member from the Joint Health and Safety Committee to join the workplace inspection. The workplace inspection will typically have an administrative portion, as well as a physical inspection of the workplace. So a walkthrough with typically the worker member, as well as a management member if they want to join along. So the questions that they might ask related to, initially they may be asking questions related to the requirements under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, to ensure that the workplace we're visiting has a strong internal responsibility system. So the IRS, simply explained, means that everyone at your retail workplace has a role to play in keeping the workplace safe and healthy, which includes workers, supervisors, employers, as well as owners. To that end, ergonomists may ask about the Joint Health and Safety Committee meetings, workplace health and safety inspections. They might ask to see where the required health and safety postings are kept, and have a look at your health and safety board. Following that, the ergonomist may also ask if you have any specific policies and procedures related to the prevention of MSDs. Maybe you have a specific handling procedure for a specific task that's geared to reducing the likelihood of an overexertion injury occurring. One example that comes to mind is in the grocery class for grocery cart retrieval. Everyone who's gone to a grocery store has seen workers bringing carts back in. And perhaps that grocery employer might have a procedure that specifies the maximum number of carts to be moved at one time. So it's a policy, it's a procedure that is geared to help mitigate the likelihood or the increased risk of having an overexertion injury associated with that task. So it's those types of policies and procedures that the ergonomist may be asking about. Workplaces may have safe ladder use procedures as well, or storage practices focused on protecting workers from a fall or MSD risk during the positioning and removal of loads from storage. In terms of safe ladder use instruction, the ergonomist may sort of focus on is there some specific procedures around the actual placement and retrieval of loads when using a ladder, because that is often in standard ladder instruction guides may not necessarily incorporate that piece. Ergonomists may ask if your workers have exposure to delivery vehicles, customer vehicles, or material handling equipment. And if so, are there any vehicle pedestrian safety policies or procedures in place at the workplace to protect workers from those potential risks? There will also likely be a question about the nature of training your workers receive. Again, it will be keeping on the theme of MSD hazard awareness, safe material handling, ladder use, vehicle pedestrian safety where applicable. So again, sort of staying on those themes that where the campaign is focused. So once the sort of administrative side of the visit is completed, then there will be a walkthrough portion of the inspection by the ergonomist. And again, this may involve taking time to observe work tasks being performed. As ergonomists, you'll see, further in the presentation, it's about the workers' interaction with the workspace. So what sort of task they're doing, the loads they're handling, the environment that they're working in. So where possible, we want to see work and how the work is being performed. So you may find that the ergonomist is spending time, observing the work tasks, talking to workers about a particular task, or the training they may have received. They may take time to gather specific measurements, such as the weights of loads, the storage location, or the frequency that a task is occurring, again, to better understand the MSD risk that might be there. So they try to capture a little bit more information to uncover if there is an elevated risk to a worker. Any area of the workplace may be visited during the walkthrough, but as I mentioned earlier, if you think of the path of the product as it goes through your workplace and the touch points where workers are performing those tasks. So, areas such as receiving or staging, storage, your point of sale areas, the delivery aspects, customer support, all those sorts of pieces. Ergonomists may spend time in one or all or some of those areas. And they may also ask to see the equipment used in the workplace to transport, move, and access loads. So they might ask about carts, or if there are any other pieces of equipment that are used to sort of help with the material handling aspect of the work. So once the walkthrough and the admin is done, once the inspection is complete, the ergonomist will leave the workplace to prepare a field visit report. And this field visit report is a written report. It'll provide a narrative that summarizes the findings from the visit. And if there were any contraventions of the act or regulations identified, and I'm going to go through some of those regulations shortly, there may be orders issued in the field visit report. And orders are simply a directive that essentially says there was a hazard, and the employer needs to take precautions to address the hazard. The ergonomist will take time to explain the orders issued and the steps that are needed to communicate the compliance measures back to the Ministry of Labor. So they'll go through all of that if there is an order issued on the field visit. And lastly, the written field visit report will also include resource information to facilitate sort of an increased awareness and knowledge regarding MSD prevention, safe ladder use, and struck by hazard awareness. Because ultimately, we really want to leave the workplace with an increased level of knowledge and awareness, and hopefully, capacity to address the hazards that this campaign is focused on. So I just wanted to go a little bit on some of the sections of the Act and the regulation in terms of how we address musculoskeletal disorders from a regulatory legislative perspective. So it starts with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So all provincially regulated employers must comply with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. This is Ontario's legislation for workplace health and safety. There are 27 regulations that have been created under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And one of those regulations is called Regulations for Industrial Establishments, under which the retail workplaces fall. So the main purpose of the OSHA is to provide that legal framework to achieve all of our goals of protecting workers from health and safety hazards on the job. And it also sets out duties for all workplace parties. So I mentioned earlier, workers, supervisors, employers, owners. All these duties are laid out within the Act to help establish a strong internal responsibility system. And by establishing the Act also sort of allows the establishment of measures and procedures for dealing with workplace hazards. And when there are specific measures and procedures, we will find those in regulation. But it also provides for the enforcement where there is non-compliance with respect to occupational health and safety. So one of the kind of key areas to focus in on is Part 3, which is the duties of employers and other persons. So general duties of the workers, of the employers, I mean. And this area, I'll just touch on a few of the sections within the duties for employers, where we find sort of where we can address those musculoskeletal related hazards and struck by hazards related to the workplace. So Section 25, if you've looked in your green book, opens with an employer shall ensure that. So I haven't sort of written out the full verbiage for each of these, but just trying to get a little bit of a flavor for what these sections sort of involved. And I've pulled out some key ones that are sort of relevant with respect to particularly material handling. So 25(1)(b) essentially relates to ensuring that the equipment, materials, protective devices that are provided by the employer are maintained in good condition. So this is directly applicable to material handling equipment in the workplace. So, if you've got equipment that's in poor condition, this often can increase the demands on the worker to perform the material handling activity, whether it's a cart that the caster is bunged up and the swivel isn't working anymore and they're really having to struggle, or ladders that are in disrepair and have no longer sit stable on the ground. There's these sorts of elements that can have a direct link to those issues that we're dealing with in this campaign. Another clause in the Act, 25(2)(a), that is our sort of clause that kind of addresses getting information and instruction to workers. So requires the employer to inform, instruct, and supervise workers to protect their health and safety. So it's very broad, but this can be applied to training in musculoskeletal disorder awareness, or specific work methods that can help to protect workers from developing an MSD. This could be specific material handling methods, safe ladder practices for placement and retrieval of product and storage. It could be the development of procedures and the provision of instruction of those procedures. And it also, what is really key to remember here is that supervision piece, that, providing that information instruction, that supervision sort of closes the loop to ensure that workers are following those safe work practices that you've instructed. The Section 25(2)D is kind of an interesting one in that it's kind of geared to both workers and supervisors being aware of the hazard in the work. So again, it says any hazard. So this could be a musculoskeletal disorder hazard. It could be a fall hazard. And it's really laying out some sort of wording that allows it says, here's the hazard. So how is the handling, storage, and use of whatever that thing, that article, that device or equipment, how does it have to be handled in order to reduce the risk related to that hazard? So this clause really highlights the need to do a hazard identification and assessment process so that you recognize what the hazards are associated with the tasks and develop safe handling methods to protect workers from the hazards that have been identified. So if we go back to that example that I shared with the grocery cart retrieval, workers performing that task need to know the hazards they are exposed to, like the MSD hazard from handling too many carts, or the struck by hazard when working in the parking lot. And they need to be instructed on what the specific handling, transportation methods, PPE, all those elements that would be required to protect them protect their health and safety. So that's how that 25(2)D can play out. 25(2)J, this clause of note applies to workplaces with more than 5 workers. So I think there was a few employers here that were in the micro category. That a written health and safety policy must be posted in the workplace. But the second part of the clause is very important, and that is that the employer must maintain a program that implements their health and safety policy. So again, our website has content that can help small businesses understand what is meant by creating a program to implement a policy, as does the WSPS. I can probably put a link. I'll write a little note to myself. I'll drop a link to that small business into the chat when I've passed it off to Dawn in a couple minutes. And lastly, 25(2)H. This is, as many might know this as the general duty clause. And this is the requirement for the employer to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. So again, where there is a specific regulation that prescribes what to do related to a hazard, then we would look to the regulation to find sort of the requirement and what the expectations are of the employer. But where there may not be, and often that the musculoskeletal disorder hazards kind of sort of find ourselves in that area where there's a hazard present, there is a requirement under this clause to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to address that hazard. I wanted to sort of draw attention. I have some yellow highlights here. The worker is central in several of these general duties of an employer. So when we talk about ergonomics, it is very much a worker-centered approach. So by taking an ergonomic approach and focusing on the worker and their interactions with their equipment, with the materials, with their work environment, this can help us to identify factors that may be creating risk for the workers related to musculoskeletal disorders, and thus helping, to reduce the potential for those injuries. So I just threw down a number of sort of ideas on activities that might be included in these sections. I'm not going to go through all of them here. It's quite a busy slide. But again, this isn't an all-encompassing list, but it just kind of shows you. I spoke to some of these when I was talking about the specific clauses, but there's some compliance activities that may be included under each of these sections to address worker, MSDs, as well as ladder use and struck by as well. So again, it's the probably the critical part is sort of being able to identify where your MSD, where you're struck by, where those ladder sort of potential issues are, and then you can sort of work through from there to address the issues. In terms of there are a few sections within the regulations for industrial establishments. That's Regulation 851. I've just sort of highlighted a few sections that relate to work environment, lifting, moving, storage of material, and has it. And so these are some requirements that might have an influence over the safe movement of materials in your workplace. So Section 11 deals with work surfaces. So floors or other surfaces used by workers must be free of hazards, obstructions. So this is kind of your housekeeping sort of section that we'll talk a little bit about in terms of how that can influence increased risk of musculoskeletal disorders. Section 20 is a section that is related to that interaction between vehicles and pedestrians in your workplace. And there is a bit of a hierarchy within that section, barriers, warning signs, and other safeguards. So again, it kind of highlights the hierarchy of if you can eliminate that interaction by creating a barrier so that there isn't that potential for that struck by, that's really kind of where you start, and then you kind of work down through that hierarchy down to that sort of PPE level. So there's many sort of areas in between that can be looked at to help protect workers from struck bys. Section 21, that's our section related to lighting. Sometimes lighting can be a factor in other things, whether it's struck bys, being able to see the loads that you're trying to handle, losing control over loads because it's dark and you start to pull something down and didn't realize there was another box on top. So lighting sometimes can be an influencing factor. And so there is a requirement that where natural lighting is inadequate, that there must be lighting provided and shadows and glare must be minimized. The next three on this chart are all under our section 45, which is our material handling section. And I wanted to highlight 45A, which is that materials, articles, things. So that's kind of any sort of product that you're managing in your workplace shall be lifted, carried, or moved in such a way and with such precautions and safeguards to ensure that it will not endanger the safety of the worker. So this is where this section can be applied to manual material handling tasks. So when I mentioned earlier that the ergonomist might take a few measurements, ask for frequencies, they're trying to gather some information about what is the work demands on this worker. And they are able to do analyses to kind of say, is this showing an elevated risk? So is this load being moved and in the manner in which this task is being undertaken, creating a risk for the worker? And we would address that identified risk related to the material handling with this type of a section. There's also section 45BI, and that relates to moving and storage of materials. So again, when you're moving product, they need to be protected from tip, collapse, or fall during transport, placement, or storage. And the last item is actually having to do with the removal of products. So materials, articles, or things need to be removed or withdrawn without endangering the safety of the worker. So again, this is where we see things that are stored at heights and look at them and say, well, how is the worker safely going to retrieve that load? Is there increased risk of a fall because they're handling a huge, Christmas tree display that was stored on the highest storage shelf in the back storeroom? How are they getting that down safely? Is there potential for a worker fall or musculoskeletal injury when trying to do that task manually? So I've been sort of going on this sort of dry stuff for a little bit. I thought we'll launch another poll here, just to get a little feedback from you folks in terms of what you find your current challenges are in your workplaces around preventing MSDs in retail.
So I don't know if you can see, Lisa, right now we have implementing solutions or controls in the Masters Clubhouse as the leader right
Okay.
now. Yeah.
It's funny because I can only see, oh, there, now I'm seeing it
Oh, you
now.
got it? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So implementing solutions seems to be the leader right now. Um, Finding solutions, assessing hazards, hazard recognition. So a little bit of um, quite a few in that category as well. So again, this is really great information for us because it helps gear, we're going to be talking about some examples as well as some solutions as we move through here. But again, it's sort of recognizing those resources that you can tap into as well. So thank you, everybody. So I'm going to pass it over to Dawn. I think you have to take it back, right, Dawn?
I did. Yep. Should be good.
Okay.
Yep.
There we
Thanks,
go.
Lisa. And Laura was nice enough to put some resources in the chat around lighting. You'll see that they are lighting in industrial establishments, a checklist and also a information sheet. There is information in there that would definitely apply to the retail environment. So yeah, so she put that in the chat, which is awesome. Thanks, Laura. So I get the pleasure over the next couple slides just to talk about ergonomics a little bit. I know that was kind of part of the polling before of understanding ergonomics and how it applies in retail and certainly the focus areas of the ministry. So just looking at the definition, just to read it out to you, ergonomics is a scientific discipline concerned with understanding the interactions among humans and other elements of a work system with the goal of optimizing human well-being and overall system performance. So the important thing there is that when you think about your worker in that retail environment, whether it's in the back room or whether it's receiving goods in the loading dock behind your retail location, or even carrying goods out to the vehicle or placing it in the trunk of a vehicle of a customer. It's that interaction with all of those elements that have the potential to put us at risk, right? And the goal of ergonomics really is to optimize that environment to mitigate that risk, as Lisa talked about before. And how does that whole system perform so people can perform safely, right? We can make decisions, we can follow pathways and be behind barriers so that as there's traffic and as there's multiple different users of that process, that people are being protected and safe when they're doing that work. And you may kind of identify with ergo being more the definition of fitting the workplace and the work demands to meet the workers' needs, right? To allow us to perform well, right? To allow us to do those tasks. So certainly having something, over our heads and trying to lift something off and they're, maybe too heavy or an unbalanced load doesn't allow us to utilize our bodies correctly or perform at a high level to do that, just because of the the limitations of our bodies from doing that type of stuff, which then could lead to accidents and injury and those types of things. So that's really what we're talking about in ergonomics, and hopefully that helps help you with understanding where ladder and like Lisa said, she'll have some examples about ladder safety and manual materials handling on ladders and those types of things is where ergonomics plays a role in ladder safety and struck by and those types of things. So, to give you a good example, I was talking to another ergo this morning, and there was, we were talking about the human's ability to apply force, kind of in a horizontal direction, right? So I'm pushing kind of out towards kind of the camera here, and the limiting factor a lot of times is our like the friction, right? That we can't really push into the floor um, as hard as we could, say, if we're lying like on a bench doing a bench press or something, right? Because we're applying force in the direction of the movement with our whole body on the floor as we're pushing up, right? But as we're pushing towards this item, we'll tend to slip with our feet, and we just can't apply the same amount of pressure and force. So how that whole system is designed and how that's organized really is limiting to how much effort we can push, right? So I may be able to bench press, 200 pounds, but again, another joke, 200 pounds, but I wouldn't be able to push that much forward because of those limiting factors. So that's really what we're looking for, right? Is how what the human's ability is to perform in that system. What is our limitations? Because we certainly have, but also what are our strengths, right? What can we do well to ensure that we're working in a safe manner? But if that environment is designed in a way that's not allowing us to do that, then that's tough for us to make the right decisions. And that's why we try to take that human-centered approach, right? What are my capabilities as humans? What can I do? What can I do? And how do we design the work around those capabilities to ensure that we reduce or eliminate the risk of an MSD? Because that's really what we're trying to do. And if we do that, then we start to see an increase in efficiencies, right? So if I design my work so that I'm able to access things easier, I'm not lifting overhead or bending down to pick up something heavy, which is, you know, not just resulting in a potential MSD risk, but um, you know, uh, costing a lot of energy, right? I mean, we tell companies all the time that if you are asking people to squat down 1,000 times a day, I mean, you're going to get tired from doing that. So if you're able to prevent that, then potentially there's more efficiency there and more productivity because we just won't be as tired from squatting down. So that's really what we're talking about ergonomics and taking that human-centered approach is really what we're doing. And so when it comes to MSDs in particular, and you may have seen this before, and this graphic is thanks to our friends at CREAMSD Center for Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, a mouthful for sure, but we do have a link to their msdprevention.com free resource guideline at the end of this presentation, but with this information in it. But generally speaking, we see a combination of risk that or these hazards, awkward postures, high force, and high repetition that we try to measure and use to determine where the risk is for the development of MSD. So certainly I can hold my arms out to the side to be able to do it, to do this. And of course I'm going to fatigue. We might constitute that as an awkward posture, but as soon as I hold something, right? As soon as I hold, I know we got the background on here is not really helping. I'm holding a coffee cup, but if you take your coffee cup and you kind of hold it in front of your body, then you're going to start to see that fatigue increase, right? So you have a high force with that awkward posture that is going to increase that risk on the shoulder, for example. So, and of course, if you do that many times, that's just adding to the risk. So you can see kind of how they interact in this Venn diagram. And you don't necessarily need all three. That's why it's like this. You can have any combination of two. Repetition to a degree is a little bit of the exception, but for the most part, it's a combination of these two hazards. So that's really what we're trying to do is people mentioned in the polls about different controls and those types of things, we're trying to reduce, an employee's exposure to these things. So, just to use an example, the reason why we want people to keep, whatever they lift closer to their body is it just reduces that awkward posture, reduces the amount of force that the back muscles have to generate to lift that box. Um, so that's really what we're trying to do, is trying to find creative ways to try to reduce these particular hazards. So really when we look at, it may look at kind of poor ergonomic implementation, or just having an environment that's not really designed, appropriately, whether that's a label that has information that's not really, in the correct order of operation, that they may interpret it incorrectly, or even visually scanning an environment when they're operating material handling equipment, um, or even manually lifting a load from a storage location, like how all of those things are designed, that interaction between the task demands, it just doesn't really meet our needs to perform the task without error, right? Or poor efficiency that leads to those types of injuries. So again, another example is, like if you take roundabouts, for example. So there's use this example lots of times, but we have lots of roundabouts where I live in Waterloo region, and the reason why, and I didn't really know this until I looked into it for this example, but um, roundabouts have trees, and I was thinking, why is there trees and landscaping and kind of a hump in the middle of these roundabouts? Because I want to see the other side to see what's going on. Um, but the reason why that's there is that so when people are driving a car, they don't drive through and over the roundabout, right? If that stuff wasn't there, they might see people drive through it as opposed to around it. So there's barriers in place to force us as we're scanning our environment to turn as we go, right? And still, people make mistakes, but certainly not driving straight through, right? So there is some idea around kind of how those types of things are laid out and designed that may result in us putting ourselves at risk. So and generally we see, not generally, but sometimes we see injuries that take a long time to develop. You just have that gradual onset. You don't kind of sit down at your desk and start typing and feel discomfort right away. In some cases, that may take years of poor posture and slouching and all those types of things that you may see that gradual onset. And you may see that with lifting, right? You just kind of lift poorly for, certain periods of time, and that kind of catches up with you. So those are the types of things we're looking at trying to prevent. And of course, there's different acute worker injuries that may occur, such as from falls, struck by, and overexertion. Lisa's going to go through some examples of kind of how manual materials handling on ladders can result in falls, different things with struck bys, and in some of her examples a little bit later. And we talked about the definition of ergonomics. We really talked about system, right? Performance in that system and how everything works together. And oftentimes, humans are resilient. We can kind of, adapt to different situations. But if we adapt to a certain situation in the wrong way, then that's where you kind of get that system failure, at least from our perspective, right? If you go to pick something up because something was put in a poor location, that may result in us having to adapt and result in injury, right? Or I know, like, probably from September till January is a big time of the year for retailers in terms of getting ready for the holiday season. So how does your system, how is that designed now? Is it robust enough to accommodate that extra individuals that you maybe have working for you temporarily, for example, or the extra material that you may be ordering in to ensure you have enough stock to kind of deal with that particular season. So ergonomics is a lot more than kind of lifting and sitting and all those types of things. It's more, is that system and everything set up so that it can accommodate what our abilities are and some of those extra things that time of year or sales that you have on, or I'm sure, and I've seen in retailers that, summer patio season and barbecues have been out for a while. So then you have more lifting, more heavy lifting that way. So is that system designed to accommodate those changes in kind of the retail seasons to ensure that we're preventing falls and struck bys and overexertion from lifting? Um, so just some brief information about ergonomics. Again, thanks Laura for putting the link in for msdprevention.com. There's a lot more explanation, of course, on our website, ministry's website, and msdprevention.com around MSD hazards, around these types of things, and a program as well. So going through the program, and we can certainly assist you in walking through the requirements of putting in a program, because the program itself will help to identify where some of these system failures may occur, and try to account for that. So but certainly able to help you out with that. So I'm going to pass it over to Lisa again, and she's going to take you through the next few slides.
Great. Thank you, Don. So I just wanted to, again, stay on that theme of sort of that worker-centered focus. And as Don was saying, it's about looking at those sort of primary, from an MSD prevention, we're looking at those primary hazards. And are those hazards that are present, are the demands associated with that work within the worker's capabilities? And this capability could be a strength capability, or a reach capability. It could be a visual capability. Like maybe there's an environmental element that that is tasking the visual capability of a worker. So always sort of keeping in mind, are we asking more of that worker than what their capacity allows? So our goal is to kind of ensure that our work demands are within work capacity. And from a material handling perspective and a safe lifting and moving and storage, I wanted to kind of just highlight all the factors in that. And again, Don was talking about that system. To keep that balance, we sort of look at what's contributing potentially to an imbalance. Could it be the load characteristic? Is it a very awkward load? Maybe the boxes got delivered and there are no cutout handholds in the box. So now it makes it more challenging to manage moving that box. Do we have the proper equipment to be able to use it to move it well with reduced risk? What's the availability of equipment? If we are getting the loads that we're receiving, do we have equipment that is suitable? The work organization, that systems approach to, how's that the work coming in? What's the planning, the time demands? Sometimes that can create increased demand on workers, and it's from a sort of leading sort of scenario where it's coming into your location. You may not feel that you have control, and now there's elevated risk. Again, the control over work demands. What sort of worker training is it? Does it match the needs of what that worker needs to ensure that they are performing their task in a safe manner? So reviewing sort of the elements that you're teaching workers in terms of protecting them from MSDs. Environmental conditions, again, that's an element that we always want to look at from a material handling perspective. What sort of workspace design, what are the reaches, where load's being stored? We talked about condition of equipment, PPE, design of equipment. Sorry for the T, it's folded over there. Your storage design can have an influence on work demands, for sure. I've seen some storage areas in workplaces where they've identified lines on the wall, so that's their indicator to workers. Okay, we're not storing loads above this height, knowing that when it goes above that, they're increasing the potential risk for material handling issues. the layout of the work area and how that can influence the movement of load. So maybe your work area is very congested and now a worker needs to actually carry a load instead of using a cart, which influences the work demands associated with the physical element of that task. Again, increasing the risk of MSD. So recognizing those contributing factors when you are trying to optimize material handling is really key. So again, this is just more of a sort of, there are others, but it's just sort of a good sort of starting point of things to sort of consider that might be influencing the demands on the workers when they're performing their material handling and storage in your workplaces. So I wanted to go through a few examples from our experiences in retail where we've seen some MSD risk. Some of these you might be very familiar with, others might be new. So I'm going to try to take it through the flow of the work environment. So starting with the product receiving, product stacked beyond functional reach. So again, soon as you introduce an extended reach above head, and it's at their functional reach, we don't have as much load control. There's more potential of the load slipping in our hands because we don't have a firm grip on it. The shoulders are at an extreme position. Talk about that awkward posture piece. So you have the awkward posture, you have force, so you've got two of those MSD elements that can increase that potential for MSDs. So keeping an eye on sort of that stacked levels of loads. Product weights for above shoulder reaches being too heavy. So again, and again, some might be saying, well, I'm not the one that my shipment comes in and I've got a really heavy load that ends up being above shoulder level. And that's where it's that system piece again, and communicating those issues back so that that information is being passed back to those that are influencing the demands on your workers. Poor access to pallets and shelves. So again, I've seen places where there's very limited space to get in. So as soon as you have your feet not in their regular sort of forward facing the load, you are introducing awkward positioning. So again, placement of items, ensuring adequate space around, repetitive and high-paced lifting and lowering when unloading products from trailers. That is also an area where we see an elevated risk. Product unloading from boxes at floor level. So, not having a workstation or workbenches or work carts for unloading boxes. So I've seen in back rooms where the boxes are just put on the floor and everything's coming out at floor level. So again, it's that sustained stooping that can increase the level of risk. Unbalanced products being handled by a single worker. So large, awkward, shifting, unbalanced loads. So again, this can be something that might be part of worker training, is recognizing, how do we recognize loads that you should be going and asking for a helper? Or maybe it's, if there's indicators on the box that identifies a 2-person team lift, but not all, that doesn't always happen. So they need to sort of understand and recognize where their risk may be. In terms of product storage, stocking, displays, ladders are a very common piece of equipment that we see in retail. Often if there's a very narrow access to the storage where the ladder just fits in there, it promotes sort of handling a load and then having to turn on that ladder. For example, the picture on the left, if you're retrieving something and you're trying to hand that down to somebody, that it's so tight in there, how are you supposed to do that without turning and rotating on that ladder, now increasing the potential for a fall that goes against safe ladder use. So sometimes, it's what I really try to encourage employers to think about is how do they, if they're asking a worker to use a ladder to retrieve loads, they have to critically look at how they do that and still follow safe ladder work practices, so that they're preventing fall risk, and also the potential for musculoskeletal. Avoiding this is, avoid heavy loads stored in hard to reach locations, whether it's really low locations where you're crouching and reaching, having to kind of pull things out, or from elevated locations. That picture on the right where you've got somebody who's trying to lift a box, the box isn't even closed. So you know that there's a potential for a shifting box. It's not as compact and solid as it could be. There's product in front of, at the bottom level of where the ladder has been placed, the step stool has been placed. So now the horizontal reach is greater. So you've got awkward postures associated with that can affect balance. So there's so many elements. Again, if we go back to those primary MSD hazards and then those contributing factors that can lead to elevated risk. Materials I mentioned in front of the shelves, poor housekeeping is another big one related to storage. So if the housekeeping is such that you cannot use a cart to move your product, now you're relying on someone having to carry the load, and now they're carrying over and stepping over product, which is potentially the risk of fall. So housekeeping, and sort of having, places and for product to be stored and organized so that workers are aware of where things need to be placed, and the importance of maintaining those aisles for the movement of loads and the safe transport. Product transport, some of the things that we've seen are overloaded carts. So there's no visual sight line. So what ends up happening, it leads to the workers having to do a pulling action versus pushing. And when we talk about material handling demands, if you can push a load where you are moving in the same direction as the load, your shoulders are in an optimal position, you are able to use the larger muscles of your back and your legs to generate that applied force. As soon as you have to turn and reach your hand behind to grab a cart and start pulling it, now again, you look back to that Venn diagram, you've just introduced an awkward shoulder posture. Now you're going to apply force through that shoulder and increase the potential of an injury occurring. Keeping your carts in good condition, that's often, what we see is carts that just there isn't a preventative maintenance program. And this is where, workplace inspections or even workers reporting that the cart really isn't working anymore, that one of the swivel isn't moving the way it should. So having sort of acknowledging that you want to hear from workers and having carts sort of identified in some fashion, because often they'll lose track. They just want to get the task done, and then they put the cart away and they don't have any way of saying which cart it was that was a problem. Uneven surfaces, ramps and raised transitions on floors, obviously that can increase our the effort to move the carts. And if the uneven lip is large enough that the casters can't sort of manage it, workers will often have to actually do a lift to try to get that cart to kind of get over that lip, which again is increasing the potential for that injury to happen. Often what we see is there's a mismatch between the design of the cart and the environment it's being worked on. So smaller casters are not going to be able to navigate larger elevation changes. You need larger casters to be able to manage that. Carts that are intended for heavier loads, you'll see have larger casters. So if you've got a cart with a small caster and you're putting a whole ton of weight on it, there might be a mismatch there in terms of its ability to kind of, or that worker's ability to kind of move that cart through the environment. And again, I mentioned the poor housekeeping and how that can influence that you can't use a cart when you need to. From a point of sale and customer service perspective, some of the things that we've identified and seen is heavy products that need to be lifted and carried out for customers. Again, having some parameters for your workers around that. Poor workstation design that introduces awkward postures, whether it's reaching for product, twisting. And again, now when we're talking about point of sale, we're getting into that perhaps potentially that repetitive element of that Venn diagram. So now you've got your awkward posture, repeated actions, and if there's any forces in terms of the types of product that they're having to move and reach for, you could have the whole trifecta impacting that worker. And that's where you might get that over time gradual onset musculoskeletal disorder. Repetitive reaching, grasping, turning during scanning methods, we're just touching on that. And then again, your carts, not being able to use a cart when you need to. Now, when we're talking about struck bys in retail, some of the things that that we've sort of noted through our experiences are products, the way they're being stored in locations that can potentially result in loads falling on a worker, whether it's during retrieval or just from the instability of how they've been stacked in the area. I don't know if you can really see the picture clearly on the right hand side, but there's a work desk there. So you consider sort of how is a worker going to safely be able to place and retrieve those loads. So again, it comes back to that section that we mentioned earlier, that 45 BII, where it's, can you withdraw it in a safe manner without the potential of a worker falling or injuring themselves from a musculoskeletal standpoint. Pedestrian workers interacting with delivery trucks. So again, just ensuring that you've considered that. You're looking at what are our practices, when do our deliveries happen? Is it dark out when our deliveries come? Those sorts of elements. So again, doing a bit of an assessment of where your potential issues are around struck bys. Stacked materials can create narrow aisles and visual obstruction. So again, if you've got equipment that is moving in a space and you've got pedestrian workers, really looking for those situations where you have blind corners. And putting mitigation in place to ensure that there's good visibility. And lastly, parking lots. Again, workers interacting with customer vehicles. That's always going to be something that will be very particular to your particular environment. But again, something to kind of assess and ensure you've got some measures in place. So I'm going to pass it back to Dawn. Take it over there, Dawn.
Well, thanks, Lisa. And I'm going to start to get into some controls and a lot of the resources that we have and will be creating in response to this campaign will be based on that flow of goods that Lisa was talking about. So when your goods come to your location and when they exit your location, and making sure that we have checklists, resources, information to help you identify those hazards or where some of those issues are. So if you have any suggestions on any of that information, then or what you would like to see or how that would impact your workplace, then feel free to work out. We're always looking for that information to help us make sure we develop something that's going to be useful for you. So just quickly, how WSPS can help. We have some information on our website that will include in a follow-up email that links to the site that gives you this information. But just a couple things. I won't go through all of these. I just want to touch on a few. The first one, am I required to work with WSPS? There is an offer to support to work with the 10 or so ergonomists we have located across Ontario. Who have expertise in these types of operations. We do have a wealth of health and safety consultants and account managers to help. But you're not required to engage with WSPS. The ministry partners with us to ensure that that transfer of knowledge is there. What the ministry is finding at workplaces, we want to be able to transfer that knowledge specifically to companies and then provide support and resources to be able to, to comply and implement best practice to ensure that that stuff is taken care of. So I don't have an ergonomics program as required. Well, the short answer is no. You don't have to have a program in place. An official ergonomics program, certainly a health and safety program, but not an official ergonomics program. But you still have to, or you're still required to identify those hazards related to MSDs and treat it the same as any other workplace hazard. So again, integrating ergonomics and MSD prevention into your existing health and safety program is best practice so that, again, like I said, a lot of the situations that come up, makes your system and your program resilient to those factors, right? Where things change or things get busy, you're hiring temporary workers, like having that program in place and integrating that within different stakeholders in your organization will help to make sure that that program can identify, recognize those issues, assess it, hopefully eliminate and control those issues as well. So what do ladders and visibility have to do with ergonomics? Ergonomics can protect workers from falling from a height. So as Lisa went through. So again, the only thing I wanted to mention for this one, as you're ascending and descending a ladder, we like to use I know you've probably heard of 3 points of contact, but we like to use 3 points of control, right? So you can certainly stand on a ladder, hold one rung of your ladder and reach out to the side, right? So technically you have 3 points of contact, but really are you in control and really vulnerable in that position? You're not as strong as you're extending out, putting pressure, even on the grip hand, you might let go because you're holding too much or something pulls you down as you're falling, and that can result in somebody falling off the ladder. Just because how you can support yourself, where you can put your feet on the ladder, you're limited, right? You may be limited to a footprint, and that results in too much for the body to handle, even with lighter loads that maybe you can handle when you're on the floor. So when you look at manual materials handling from ladders, we do have a lot of information about that. The ministry has a bunch of information on their website. We do have some checklists that we're just reviewing right now to look at ascending and descending ladders and making sure that you can see where you're stepping and those types of things. So and certainly with visibility as well, about not being able to see the worker, you can't notice them even though they're in your line of sight based on certain things. So so we can certainly help you identify where some of those factors will be. And like Lisa mentioned before, and Laura put in the chat about lighting, I mean, sometimes you blend into the background, you're busy, you're trying to get things out, and that's where all the variables come into, to where when injury can happen. So we do have another poll, so we can launch the poll right now. So based on some resources that we are going to be developing, and some of these things we do have, but we want to make sure it's targeted specifically to what your needs are. So you can see here, are you looking for design ideas, any storage principles, how we can optimize workflow and efficiency, any material handling tips, ladder safety when you're handling materials, how might best your workers work in and around mobile equipment. So right now we have material handling tips up there, storage principles, working around mobile equipment. Okay, training workers. Yep, for sure. Some material handling tips. Okay. Yeah, and like we get, thank you. You can close the poll. That's great. And we get it. You're limited sometimes into the footprint of your your particular location, and sometimes that's a barrier. So but as Lisa mentioned, like the front of the store, just using a typical retail location, but there's, we put the front of the store designed in a way to get customers to purchase items and be able to visually see everything. but workers are not just working in that environment. They have to go to the back and look in storage areas and receive materials, and all those types of things need to be designed with the same thought process. Some of that has to do with some of that material handling activities, ladder uses, those types of things. But okay, so we know that that's good. We can work at developing some materials around those two things. Just in the little bit of time we have left, I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, just because we do have a couple of questions I want to ask Lisa. But this picture you see here in the next couple slides, it's from this Ergo Insights document around manual material handling. We do have a safety connection coming up. I just put that in the link in June, but it kind of goes through design principles for the storage of some materials. So it was answered in the chat, which is great. But in this, we're trying to provide you with some information on, if you are going to rearrange where things are placed, or what you have to reach for. A lot of this information here is designed to help you place boxes, as you can see in the green zone, for example, closer to the body. So it helps review some of those reaching distances, placing items within that power zone, right? If there are more frequently designed items, frequently accessed items that are heavier, what position do we put those in? Well, we put them in usually in between around, mid-thigh to kind of chest areas, kind of the power zone we call it, is really where we want to be. You saw a picture, Lisa had a picture of somebody lifting dog food, heavy bags of dog food. Like, let's put, if possible, can we put that in a position where employees are lifting that as opposed to overhead? You look at things like space requirements, right? There, again, some pictures of compact space environment. You may do that, but then if you have to alter your position or twist because you need to move around different boxes because there isn't enough space, then that, again, that's adding to the increased amount of risk. So, are there any unloading procedures to limit that repetitive lifting when people are unloading a truck, for example? Can you create an unloading station to prevent stooping? Again, I've used the example of the squatting. Again, squatting 1,000 times. Can we, have an unloading station, for example, to prevent all of those squatting, right? And again, I can't tell you, squatting, 999 times is safer than, 1,000 times. So there's no number that way, but we can certainly look at, how all of those risks go together to where that increase in risk would be. So certainly reducing the number of times you're squatting certainly is best. And of course, do you have any unbalanced products, for example, that a single worker is using? How do you, emphasizing of using that material handling equipment? So again, if I'm holding something that's unbalanced, there may be more pressure on my right side than my left as I'm holding it. I may twist my back as I'm doing it to support that load, resulting in more pressure on the back. So so just as you're receiving, are there certain things you can do to kind of mitigate that? And this document will certainly help you as a good starting point anyways. And again, same with product storage. I talked about kind of keeping it, you can see in the green zone here, ideal, frequent. We put some measurements in here as well. So, try to give you some design guidelines to follow of the placement of certain materials for different segments of the population, male and female distances here, to ensure that you're putting those boxes or material in that kind of ideal range to ensure that you are mitigating some of those risks, right? Twisting, turning, leaning with loads in hands on a ladder, for example. Again, as you're ascending and descending the ladder, is it forcing me based on how things are laid out and designed that I need to twist? That can result in a fall or an MSD from the fact that we're putting more pressure on my back because I am ascending and descending that ladder holding a box, for example. Poor housekeeping, carry demands and clutter cluttered and narrow aisleways, again, resulting in more trip hazards and that sort of thing. And again, we have product transport here as well. Again, to Lisa's point about casters, I've had an example of flight attendants where some of their beverage carts are harder to push, and this may be a little bit gross, but a lot of the wheels started to get gummed up with hair and material from the floor of the airplane. So it's important that those types of things are occurring, that you need to account for those situations when you're looking at pushing and pulling and having that preventative maintenance program. And then, of course, point of sale for customer service. Have a process for lifting and carrying products to customer vehicles. Do you have some material handling equipment? Do you design things so that you have the customer do most of the work? Of course, you don't want to get them hurt, but the thought is that the employee is there all day lifting stuff. So just having a process in place for doing that is important. So there's just a bit of information there about point of sale and that sort of thing. And of course, struck by hazards in retail, lighter items on higher shelves, for example. Again, there's always a risk of falling for those types of things, but if you have heavier things up top, then that can certainly do a lot more damage if it falls on somebody. And certainly just providing that ongoing training for workers who are interacting with customer vehicles, making sure crosswalks and other areas are well marked so that the employees may know what they're doing all the time, but you have customers that may not, right? They're not there all the time with those. So those variables kind of need to be accounted for, as you're kind of looking at training and pavement markings and those types of things. So assuming customers know what they're doing, we want to make sure that those types of things are accounted for. Just a couple of other campaigns. We have a ML-ITSD campaign and exposure to chemical agents in women's training. That Safety Connection is April 24th. So click on that link. We'll include that stuff in our follow-up email for you. And just something in more Southwest Ontario. For those of you joining us from Southwest Ontario, we do have an initiative for tender fruit growers. You can click on that link as well, and we'll provide that in there as another webinar for tender fruit growers. This looks a little bleedy for me on my screen. I'm not sure why it's like that. It's not like a fancy whatever. Those links are weird, but anyways, there's a bunch of resources here. We'll make sure we send those resources out to you in a follow-up email as well. And just sorry, I'm burning through this because we're almost done, but just another poll question. So if you want to launch that poll question here, be great. So this is a three-part poll question. So just to answer the first question, you'll see on the bottom right of your poll question, there's kind of 3 pages. So just click on the next one. If you can answer that for us as well, it would be fantastic. So following this webinar, how would you rate your current knowledge on manual materials handling and storage? So you can click on there, it would be great. So getting some responses. And then following this webinar, how would you rate your current knowledge on ladder use and storage? Perfect. And the last one is, following this webinar, how would you rate your current knowledge on pedestrian safety and struck by? So not expecting miracles that you know everything and everything's advanced for this, but just helps us to plan future safety connections and information for you. Would greatly help your responses. It's great. So close that poll, be fantastic. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. There was a couple questions in the chat, so I promise I'll get you answers for those questions, and we'll send those out. Again, if you do have any questions, concerns, thoughts about the webinar, resources that you would like to see developed, please feel free to reach out. If you do know any other small business, if there's any other retailers, for example, that you frequent in your town or where you live that could benefit from the information, the resources that we posted in the chat, then please forward that information to them. We do have a small business team and a small business center that you saw that we posted in the chat. That we really want to help these companies out. So feel free to pass on that information. So again, we appreciate everybody's time today. Lisa, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to give us some great advice. And again, if you have any further questions, please get in contact with WSPS. I put my email address in the chat. If you know your account manager, reach out to them as well. Customer service or the MLITSD contact center, reach out to them as well. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.